Welcome everyone to Tadaima 2021, and thank you for joining us for this important program commemorating the 20th anniversary of the terrorist attacks on September 11th, 2001. I am Rob Buscher. You may know me as the film curator for Tadaima, but tonight I'm going to be speaking in my capacity as the president of the Japanese American Citizens League Philadelphia chapter. I'm joined here by two of my esteemed colleagues who I'm really excited to engage in dialogue this evening. Dr. Fariha Khan, the co-director of the Asian American Studies program at University of Pennsylvania, and Dr. Ahmet Selim Tekelioglu, Education and Outreach Director at the Philadelphia chapter of Council on American-Islamic Relations. Before we get things started, I would love to open up to each of the panelists to give a more extensive self-introduction. Faria, maybe we can start with you.
Sure. Well, thank you, Rob. Thank you for organizing this panel and for inviting me. I'm delighted to be here with all of you. As Rob mentioned, my name is Fariha Khan. I'm the co-director of the Asian American Studies program at the University of Pennsylvania. I also teach there. I teach courses on South Asian Americans as well as Asian American communities and Asian American food, which is, a joy to be able to teach and to work with the students. I served for 4 years on the Pennsylvania Governor's Commission, the Advisory Commission for Asian American Affairs. And that was quite an honor to be able to meet many Asian American citizens throughout the state and to learn about their communities, some of their triumphs and as well their challenges.
Thank you, Faria. Ahmed?
Yeah, no, thank you so much. It's an honor to be here with you, Rob, and with Fariha, and with you all watching. My name is Ahmet Tekelioglu. I'm originally from Turkey. I'm an academic and an organizer based in Philadelphia. I live in the Allentown area. And yeah, no, my research is on American Islam, on American Muslims, and I sort of straddle between community-based work and academic work. So it's really an honor to be with you and thinking together about some commonalities and differences.
Yeah, and I really appreciate you both making time this evening. Since we're all here on the East Coast, it is a little late for us, but certainly it's an important time as we commemorate the 20th anniversary of 9/11, a day that certainly has decided the fate of our nation, really, in many ways for the last 20 years. I think that there are few events that have been as ground changing in terms of the overview of foreign policy, as well as the way that many communities have experienced the surveillance state, the broad overreach of executive powers, and many of the things that we will be getting into throughout our discussion. Of course, we kind of predicate this discussion this evening from the Japanese American community's perspective, having witnessed what happened to our own community in the wake of Pearl Harbor. There were many incredibly uncomfortable similarities. And I think that as soon as the attacks occurred, the Japanese American Citizens League began outreach under the leadership of John Tateishi and Floyd Mori, trying to do some damage control immediately, understanding that our community suffered the kind of wrath of the American public after Pearl Harbor, when of course Japanese Americans were Americans and had nothing to do with the attack, no more so than the Muslim and Arab and Middle Eastern American communities who began to suffer the effects of Islamophobia post 9/11. And certainly we have had a resurgence of those kinds of anti-Muslim sentiments as over the past 5 or 6 years, which I think unfortunately kind of dovetails into the COVID pandemic, when Asian Americans are now also experiencing the impact of anti-Asian racism, including violent hate crimes. So this evening's discussion is really about kind of understanding the similarities and differences that our communities have experienced. Certainly there are a lot of echoes to the past in the events that happened post 9/11. Nothing repeats directly, but certainly there are ripple effects across history. And we're going to do our best to kind of surface some of those connections as we talk through the panel this evening. So, to get us started, Fariha, would you be able to give us an overview a little bit around some of the topics related to xenophobia in the history of the United States and sort of how that trends into 9/11?
Sure, happy to do that. So, what I would begin with saying is that most often it is the case that we, in our high school systems, in our US academic systems, we do not learn about the Asian American experience. So certainly there are moments in the school curriculum where we may have a brief minute about Chinese exclusion, or certainly we learn about Japanese internment, but it's not a holistic perspective, and it is not a perspective that portrays Asian Americans as part of the US fabric, right? And so the other issue that I have that, I want to just put out there for all of us to think about is that very often when we talk about Asian American history, we talk about discrete communities, and we don't actually think about the ways in which communities have shared some of these struggles and challenges. And so I want to really emphasize that for us tonight is Asian migration to the US has always been about exclusion and the racialization of labor. Okay. And I think that that's really important for us to think about, right? So there are just some basic key dates that I want to throw out there for you. And probably many of you are already familiar with these dates. In 1882, we have the Chinese Exclusion Act. Around the same time, many young men from the farming community in the subcontinent of India were also arriving in the US and also faced a great deal of racism and discrimination. As those numbers became larger, we see in 1924 a very strict immigration act that basically barred all migration from Asia, right? But even before that, we had a community of Chinese Americans. We had a community of Indian Americans settling on the West Coast. In 1922, Ozawa goes up against the Supreme Court to apply for citizenship and was denied. It's only a year later that Bhagat Singh Thind applies for citizenship, right? So these conversations were happening at the same time with multiple Asian American communities. It wasn't as if these discrete conversations were happening without any interaction. Many Asian Americans farmed together, they built the railroads together, and they worked in lumber yards together. And that's really important to remember. After the complete shutdown almost of Asian migration, it's not until 1946 where there are new laws that are established to allow a very limited number of individuals coming to the US. And it was actually not until 1965 where the Immigration Act is passed that we see really the US change, right? The face of the United States changes. But what I would say, and many people may not be aware, even though probably many of us, together tonight, are in the US because of the 1965 Act, right? The story that often doesn't get told is the incredible amount of xenophobia right before Lyndon B. Johnson signs the 1965 Act at the feet of the Statue of Liberty, right? And I just want to read a quote. Lyndon Johnson wants to make all Americans feel a lot better about this new Immigration Act that's going to, potentially allow a lot of Asians to come to the U.S. And he says, as he signs this bill, he wants to comfort all the racist individuals that were opposing this Immigration Act. And he says, and I want to just quickly quote, "This bill that we will sign today is not a revolutionary bill. It does not affect the lives of millions. It will not reshape the structure of our daily lives, or really add importantly to either our wealth or our power." So whether he believed that 100% or not, we can debate, but in essence, I don't think he had a sense of the great impact that immigration bill would have. Nonetheless, all of the immigration that has come from Asia has been intrinsically tied to labor, right? We see labor in the building of railroads, farming, the lumber yards. Later, we see different kinds of labor in terms of the 1965, when we have very skilled labor coming to the U.S. to fulfill healthcare needs, to fulfill scientific and engineering needs that the U.S. had. So the racialization of labor also becomes linked with all Asian Americans, right? So despite the kinds of industries that they were involved in, the Asian American body was racialized as to the labor that they could offer the U.S. And so our histories, right, of all people from Asia in the U.S. is tied to a history of exclusion and to a history of racialized labor.
Yeah, thank you for that incredibly condensed summary that managed to carry so much of that important history. I really appreciate that, Fariha. One of the things that I was thinking about, when you're talking about exclusion, we often talk about the racial component, and I think the religious component is one that actually doesn't get as much attention. But by virtue of the South Asian community commonly being referred to as Hindu, right, by a religious group versus an actual ethnicity or even a nationality in that early 20th century migration time period. And then in the incredible scholarship of Dr. Duncan Buchan Williams, his recent book, American Sutra, he investigates exhaustively the role that Buddhism played in the alienation and exclusion and ultimately the anti-Japanese legislation that led to the mass incarceration during World War II. So I've been thinking a lot as we kind of come up on this anniversary about, again, these kinds of organic connections that I think a lot of Japanese Americans could make. Certainly having something as cataclysmic as a terrorist attack, there's immediately this kind of knee-jerk response that I think most Americans sort of felt in some way or another. And being a Japanese American myself, with my memories of 9/11, I recall being in class with a friend of mine who was Pakistani American, and he was terrified because there was a rumor that the bombers had come from Pakistan, and immediately this was this, and right, and so whatever I was thinking up until that moment, I kind of had this immediate empathy that it was just like, oh my God, like this is what it must have felt like for my great grandparents and my obachan, like on, December 7th, like this is probably something that they were experiencing and feeling. And, I know that people felt that same way throughout the country, throughout the community. But again, thinking about, although there are many similarities, there are also certainly differences here. And I think it's important to kind of name those. And I'm wondering, Ahmed, if you could kind of give us a sense from your perspective on some of the maybe similarities and differences between these experiences of Japanese Americans and Muslim Americans.
Of course, no. I mean, this is a subject, both the differences and the similarities that I continue to learn. I think, as Professor Khan mentioned, we remain sort of relatively uneducated on the Japanese American experience, and academic knowledge is only takes you to a certain place, and that's why we have been seeking sort of like mutual spaces to learn more from one another. But I think there are, of course, a few similarities that we could mention, right? So one is a blanket sort of definitions applied to large swaths of populations. Second is feeling the heavy hand of the state and the structural violence of the state, and perhaps also seeing that it's unfortunate that sometimes legal systems, right, do not really come to the aid of those who suffer civil rights violations and others. And I think that's an important aspect, and I think it became very clear cut during the discussions around the Muslim and African bans, that after so many years people were still looking at the Supreme Court, but they still had memories of, or were reminded that the Supreme Court had justified the internment, right? And legalese and realities that communities go through are different things. I think, of course, listening to some of the survivors of the internment camps and others, and continuing to learn from you all, younger generation Japanese Americans, Rob, has reminded me that a lot of my interviews with American Muslim youth who early on in their efforts to navigate the post 9/11 realities in the United States, I always remember one young woman from Fremont, California, who was speaking with me when I was doing research there with second generation American Muslims, telling how she didn't want anything to do with her Afghan or her Muslim identity post 9/11 because it was just too much to carry as a young high school student, I think middle school student, and that that process led to sort of internal struggles and discussions around who am I, where do I belong to, but also navigating how the older generation has, perhaps in an effort to protect the younger generation, sometimes took it as a solution to sort of become more insular. Whereas we have also seen, and I think that's important to remember, that broadly American Muslim communities have experienced a maturation process after 9/11 in terms of coming to grips both with their American Muslim identity, and of course this story should not be sort of applied to the African American Muslim experience, because that experience has its own dynamics in terms of navigating that landscape, a much longer story than 9/11, much longer story of engaging with the security state, engaging with the law enforcement agencies, right? So that's a mistake that we often make on the Muslim side, saying everything changed with 9/11 and this and that happens. Sometimes putting brackets to the African American Muslim experience that are not learning enough from that experience. But listening to some Japanese American leaders talk about that process, and of how everything from like culture to names to language and all was impacted by post Pearl Harbor realities and that navigation of Japanese American identity. I think really has a lot of similarities with many of the communities that I continue to work with even today, right? We come across students who continue to face bullying and discrimination and name calling, and I think these have continued to be shared experiences. And I think it also shows us that history doesn't progress linearly, right? So as years pass, we do not necessarily progress with the ideas of becoming more open, more liberal, more accommodating, more sort of free of errors and problems. There are, I believe, however, some other sort of differences as well, right? So in the case of the Muslim American experience, 9/11 was, of course, one tragedy in point, but ongoing cycles and spheres of events outside the United States continued to have a direct impact on how American Muslims were navigating their daily lives and their engagement with both the broader public and also with the state agencies, right? So we've seen, cycles around, what's going on in Iraq, in Afghanistan. The invasions, of course, has impacted those realities, as well as, later on emergence of organizations like ISIS and all, right? So, the idea of continuing to feel that pressure of apologizing for whatever is happening elsewhere by people who claim to represent the faith tradition that the members of the faith tradition of course reject, has been a dynamic, I think, that's a bit different than the Japanese American experience. And I think that ongoing sort of outsider threats and the media perception and ongoing sort of depictions. Not that I think, as you have highlighted in a very sort of insightful presentation, that those kind of depictions and symbolisms around anti-Asian hate has stopped. We are seeing it today, right? Anti-Asian hate is so deeply rooted, structural, is still there. In the case of course, the Muslim American experience, we have continued to experience and see the dominance of those trends as well, from everywhere, from movies to many other places. And there are efforts to counter that. I believe one thing for American Muslims to learn, and I'm sure we'll talk about some aspects of this from the Japanese American experience, is to start building a positive agenda and not merely responding to hate, right? In terms of institutionalization, in terms of being outspoken representatives for the experiences of their community and educating others. I think there is a moment, and I'm seeing this in the American Muslim community as well, including in my own organizations, where culture from a more defensive, always reacting mode to positive agenda building and positive allyship building, mode has, I think, already taken place. Multiple Muslim American organizations in the post 9/11 era have matured in different ways, and I think that has been one experience that we can definitely continue to learn much more from the Japanese American experience. I know for the audiences watching from California, my colleagues in California, in San Francisco Bay Area, in Los Angeles, have taken on those opportunities to build relationships with Japanese American communities and learn from their experiences and learn how to develop public-looking programming that can be insightful about both the Japanese American experience, but also about the broader American story and how we are imagining America to be. I hope that some of this was helpful.
Absolutely. And you've covered a lot of really insightful topics. I wanted to pull a couple of those threads out to just kind of comment and then maybe open it back up to both of you for questions. But, in terms of the fundamental differences, I think very astutely the understanding that, of course, Muslims are of all different races and ethnicities and nationalities. And we have American Muslims who have been here for many generations. We have others who are new and recent immigrants, and trying to understand and really speak as a singular community is not productive. And in the same way that Asian Americans and Japanese Americans are not a monolith, neither is the Muslim American community. But, one of the other things, just thinking about how then it becomes a very interesting conversation of how religion presents, because to different extents, like some people become more of a target based on perhaps the religious garb that they're wearing. If there's a racist or conservative who's inclined to commit a hate crime, in the same way that, a Japanese person can't change the shape of their eyes, there are certain things like that are inherent, I think, to these experiences as we experience hate in real time. And I think, that's definitely a similarity, I think, that is shared. But thinking a little bit about, that idea that you said in terms of how does the community move past reacting to this event and kind of into a phase of positive programming and also teaching around this. And I think to a certain extent, that's a good question, perhaps for the elder generation of Japanese Americans, of how quickly that process happened, because my sense is that it took many decades for Japanese Americans to feel that they were safe enough to actually make these kinds of statements, even to the extent that many Japanese Americans, as you probably know, were reluctant to speak about the wartime incarceration for decades. It wasn't really until the younger generation matured to the point where they began asking these questions, and the civil rights era is taking place, and of course getting swept up in that transformative change. I think as a community, it has taken us the better part of 60 years, maybe even we're still grappling with it to a certain extent, of how do you stop apologizing for something that you had no responsibility for. I know certainly growing up, and even today, on December 7th, I always feel some kind of way, and I think it's hard, I don't know how long that's going to continue, but it's certainly something that I think most Japanese Americans are hyper aware of that anniversary. And, I hope that we can kind of move past that in the same ways that we hope that the Muslim American community can move past that. But I guess, thinking about maybe some of those strategies, techniques, are there ways forward that either of you are aware of, different curriculum or public programming that the different organizations within the Muslim American community are engaging in to this effect, that perhaps this audience could also benefit from?
Rob, let me just jump in and make a couple of points. I definitely agree with you that the religious identity is a critical one, when it is an identity like Buddhism or Islam that, is largely considered not to be part of the Judeo-Christian tradition, right? And so when you have a group of people that are migrating and are really considered racialized for their labor, and then you add a foreign religion, a foreign religion to that, it definitely increases the xenophobic rhetoric. Right. And so that's really problematic. I think the other thing that's really important to remember is the ways in which immigrants build their lives in the US is often tied to US foreign policy, right? It impacts how we may structure teaching our children about our heritage, how we may practice our faith, right? Our access to a mosque or a temple is also impacted by those things. We may not feel safe going to a mosque if there is a lot of rhetoric around hate or potential violence at our houses of worship. And unfortunately, in the past few years, we've seen a lot of violence at houses of worship, at the Sikh temple, the Jewish temples, mosques as well. So that I think is sort of important to remember. I also want to think about, definitely communities have fear of the government, a lack of trust possibly of the government. We see this with Japanese Americans that really just wanted to get back to their lives in many ways, right? And so for Muslim Americans, it's similar because it's incredibly painful. When we traveled the state and met with multiple communities, bullying was a very serious issue with our children, and parents were not aware of the bullying. So in dealing with all of this, I kind of feel that the burden of education is upon our communities to make other people feel better about us, right? And so it's something to think about, that while there can be education and we can offer resources, whose responsibility is it to educate or to bring awareness, right? And I think that's a complicated issue. So I would just pose that to think about.
Yeah, and just to add on that, that's very insightful, Professor Han. There's these figures that, right? So many Americans, more than 60%, according to some studies that was done in the mid 2000s, do not know a Muslim in person, right? And it's there's correlation between knowing a Muslim and having positive viewpoints about Islam and Muslims. However, there is also the interpersonal and group bias difference, right? So sometimes people do personally know a Muslim, and that they might hold positive viewpoints about that person individually, but still continue to hold a group bias about Muslims at large, and they make an exception for Fariha, for Ahmet, for whoever that they might know. That's because our communities feel the burden of that. Sometimes in talks, I feel like Muslim students, especially young people, feel like they are walking embodiments of Islam and Muslims, and so that they should carry the burden of being sometimes the perfect Muslim, because someone might get the wrong idea about Muslims if you do something wrong, and it's a very heavy burden to carry for anyone. And in internal conversations within the community, I also sometimes see that point being taken to a place where it's really unimaginable for any other community to do, right? It's our responsibility to make our haters feel good about us, right? And it's our responsibility to make sure that they don't have negative opinions. Obviously, there is always room for more conversation, for meaningful pathways to create these opportunities, but for our communities to always feel like it's their fault that people have misperceptions about Islam and Muslims is also a very heavy burden. And I think your comments made me think about that, and think about sometimes well-intentioned teachers that I come across who ask Muslim students to explain very complex things to their classmates because they are Muslims, right? So it would be as if asking like the most complicated Sunday school question to a Buddhist and say, "You're a Buddhist, why don't you explain this to us and walk us through all the intricacies of this subject?" And I think, Rob, like Professor Han said, I'm seeing that even though I have some concerns around like the idea of storytelling as an industry, right? So everyone needs to have a story. I think people have become more sort of prone to this idea that we can take our own narratives into our hands and just express ourselves however we are, with the full diversity of the community, as we have spoken, across racial lines, across ethnic lines, across different levels of religiosity. And I'm seeing people, poetry groups within the Muslim community and other things, really have mushroomed in the last 10, 20 years. Processes like, Moss Story Har and others, I think, are finding their pathways. And I'm finding those creative opportunities as places where some of the things that often are underreported, as Professor Han mentioned, really come through, different forms of art, including like stand-up comedy, right? So that's a very sort of vibrant field for American Muslims to express their realities, of everyday realities, right? So both, there are a number of American Muslim stand-up comics who are, just, there and using their creativity with humor to express issues around civil rights, issues around, intracommunal issues and other realities.
I would just quickly also add, I think that we live in the world of all this amazing global technology and social media, and that really helps to begin conversation and to find, these moments of connection as well. So in many ways, some of that burden isn't so severe when it can be shared very easily, with others through those different kinds of mediums.
Yeah, I think the mediatization of the story is significant. I feel because again, from the Japanese American perspective, we didn't see a critical viewpoint on the incarceration until probably Robert Nakamura's 1970 film Manzanar, and we still like I think as a community are starved for those kinds of acknowledgments in like mainstream media culture. Certainly, I think there's a general awareness of it, but it wasn't until AMC's The Terror season 2 decided to stage their series inside of a Japanese American incarceration camp that we ever actually saw in mainstream television. Those kinds of stories told, and it was still within the context of like a genre, a horror genre, which I think to an extent makes a lot of sense, given the horror of being incarcerated by your own government. But to the point that Ahmed made about the comedy, I'm glad you brought that up because I remember seeing several members from the Axis of Evil comedy tour. They started doing that, I think, pretty soon after, maybe like within a couple of years of 9/11, and certainly after George Bush had coined that phrase. But they came actually to my college campus, and I think that was one of the first times that I was really aware of that the ability to use comedy to really critique something that was as large and burdensome as the United States foreign military industrial complex, and that was kind of a revelation for me. I actually lived abroad in part because I couldn't stand being in this country at the time when he was reelected for that second term, and the invasion of Iraq had happened recently, and I just felt like again, as a Japanese American, we had played through how many of these kinds of foreign wars in Asia, and thinking about Vietnam and the secret wars in Laos and Cambodia, and the devastation that wrought, and ultimately the quagmire that resulted in the refugee crisis. And these were the kinds of things on my mind as a 19-year-old kid, and I guess it was really frustrating to not be able to have that discourse in the United States at that time. I felt, at least in rural suburban Connecticut where I had grown up, that wasn't really a dialogue that you could have in public, because there was just such a heavy burden within the propaganda of that time period. And that was one of the topics that we had explored in the American Peril exhibit, which I had given a separate presentation on as part of Tadaima. If folks are interested in looking at that, we talk a lot about the experiences across history of different Asian ethnic communities, how they were racialized through what I term racial propaganda, including the various Muslim American communities. But yeah, again, sort of thinking about like how one uses media to tell these stories. We had the opportunity to work with the Center of Asian American Media when they hosted a Muslim Youth Voices video workshop here in Philadelphia as the Philadelphia Asian American Film Festival. And I felt like that was probably one of the best opportunities to empower young American Muslims to be able to tell their own stories using media technology. And are there other such projects that perhaps we could push our audience towards?
I know of like some organizations running, for example, script writing workshops, or like specific like internship opportunities for people to sort of like intern, in Hollywood, with an opportunity to actually sometimes serve as a counter sort of story to many of the stereotypes that continue to be impactful. AMPAC is an organization that has invested a lot in that, I think, to their credit, and have built in networks on that level. There are other organizations that have been, working on the art scene to sort of like bring more attention to that. There are local sort of, I think, museums that have been that haven't received the attention that they deserve, but that they have been able to put together sort of like community-looking archives that I think are always very, very helpful. Those are some things that come to my mind, as well as I feel like, Professor Khan mentioned, people like creatively using hashtags, creatively using sort of internet sometimes to hijack, the messages, like hijacking in the right, in a positive sense, or counter, the discourses that are coming through sort of creative hashtags. I think those have been some of the things that I have seen. There are some other opportunities, and I'll be happy to try to compile a list of some of these. I think, like you, Rob, you're a professional podcaster. Your podcasts are really very insightful. I'm also seeing a lot of podcasts around building, like I said, community archives, talking with people who have had an impact on the broader sort of story of the American Muslim sort of experience. I think these are some of the projects that I have seen. There's one that will come to me in just a minute, that I particularly write, like two colleagues from actually the Bay Area. Diffused incongruence is the name of the podcast. Diffused congruence, I think. So it's called Diffused Congruence: The American Muslim Experience. I can put it in the chat. That series, I think, has been really interesting to follow, because it gives a platform to people from different parts of the United States that have had an impact on the broader story. But maybe Professor Khan might have other ideas as well. Locally in our area, like, so for example, 12 Gate is an art gallery, is doing great work to sort of give voice and platform to different expressions of the Muslim experience. Now they are running a gallery, an exhibit on the Black Iranian sort of collective. So yeah, I'll stop there. Sorry, I didn't offer too much in the way of concrete sort of resources, but I'll be happy to try to think more of those.
No, that's fantastic. Fariha, were there others that came to mind for you?
Well, not to plug the Asian American Studies program at Penn, but allow me to just plug it for 1 second. Please join our listserv. We have lots of events. One of the, positive things that came out of the COVID pandemic is many of our talks are now virtual. And so, and many of them, actually, most of them are available to the broader community. So please do join us. Sign up for our listserv. I put in the address there, and you'll be able to have a sense of some of the talks and events that we're hosting, and you're certainly welcome to join us. The other thing that I would mention, and Professor Ahmet is a member of this as well, is that we just put out a curriculum. We worked very hard with our other colleague, Dr. Amina Ghaffar Kuker from the Graduate School of Education in a project called Beyond 9/11. That project is a series of 20 different modules that are lessons on 9/11 and post 9/11, really allowing educators for grades 9 to 12 to dive deeply into the experiences that post 9/11 has had on different communities in the US, right? Not just Muslim communities. And so it's an amazing opportunity to learn about 9/11. I want to just say that I taught class yesterday, and I'm teaching a class that has juniors and seniors. They're all about 20, 21 years old. And I asked them, what do you know about 9/11? And they actually know very little, right? So in their own high school experiences, yes, there's an introductory lesson or a basic overview, but not any sense of the deep implications that have occurred and still occur for multiple communities in the US. And so I encourage you to also take a look at that. I think the link is here. It's called Teaching Beyond 9/11, and it's on the Graduate School of Education's website at the University of Pennsylvania. So those are two important resources.
Yeah, that's terrific. Thanks for sharing that, Fariha. I was going to ask you about the curriculum anyways, and I think I do want to leave a little room here for questions from the audience. So if you are following along live, feel free to add any questions or comments into the chat box, and we'll try to get to them if we can. But just kind of thinking about, the different resources that we've shared here tonight, and especially the curriculum, this is a difficult topic to teach. And I think that in our own ways, many Americans who lived through 9/11 have some kind of trauma related to that day. I think the trauma is different, obviously, depending on what your relationship is to that. If you're a community who has been targeted as a result of Islamophobia, there's a different kind of trauma. As someone who grew up in the New York metro area, there's a specific trauma related to that, and knowing people who lost their lives in that tragedy. But thinking about the trauma being a reason why, in all honesty, we probably haven't had as open discussion as we should have. But I guess also the idea of teaching history for those of us who are academics currently, who lived through this, we might not be thinking of it as history yet. But certainly in your example, Fariha, undergraduate college students, most of them at this point weren't born. So there is a real need to kind of address that and do some serious scholarship around it. And I know that there has been great scholarship done on that. But how do we kind of overcome those barriers, and how do we get more people to integrate this kind of curriculum and topic into the classroom? Any suggestions or ideas?
Ahmed, were you going to say something? Go ahead.
No, please go ahead.
Well, I would say, it's such a complex topic. And I think that many times educators or myself feel overwhelmed as to where do I even begin, right? And there is also a definite need for sensitivity around these conversations. They can be very traumatic. Our students have been, if they are Muslim American or appear to be a Muslim American, right? There is a lot of discrimination and bullying that their experiences. And so, having these conversations can be incredibly traumatic for them. It can be very difficult for an educator to navigate very strong sentiments in a classroom as well. So it's very complicated, but I think the willingness and to do the complicated task of addressing these issues as well as having the support, right? Having a curriculum like this, it's incredibly rich. It does not follow a linear path. You can pick module 19, do that one first, go back to, module 2. The lesson plans are designed to be interactive. So I think those particular factors make it less intimidating to approach this. And let's be frank, not only do our students not get educated on this, right? Really, many of our teachers don't have the academic background on the Asian American experience, on Islamophobia, on Japanese incarceration, right? And so it's probably not part of their education as well. And now, here, go teach this incredibly complicated, incredibly sensitive topic. So I think I applaud those that are willing to do it. It's necessary. It's wonderful that these resources exist, and it's hard, but it's really necessary. It's necessary for our students to be able to be seen and to be heard and to be understood as part of the American landscape.
Thank you for that. Ahmed, do you have anything to add?
I think what I will add is, and I think that was a very good answer, is that, like Professor Khan said, what I come across often when we receive complaints from students who say that, in their class, a video was shown that was just completely out of context, that's just completely stereotypically sort of covered what happened and blanket sort of, guilt. And when we engage the teachers, they often say, oh, we pulled it from this sort of credible website. Or sometimes things are in the textbooks, and the textbooks have not been revised for many years and have problems. Like we said, there is a problem of underreporting in our communities, and this was a shocking thing for me when I first heard this from one of the students who responded to one of the anti-bullying surveys one of our chapters ran. That person said that when my relatives are running for their lives or are being bombed in my homeland, I'm not just going to make much fuss about some kid calling me names, right? So it's really like shows you how interconnected and how structural problems are. On the one hand, America, bombs a country, and people, civilians, are afraid for their lives. On the other hand, the relative of that person who was born in the United States is facing bullying and discrimination in the classroom, but is choosing to not say anything because, in comparison, it's a non-issue, right? So despite that underreporting, we still get a lot of complaints around the time of 9/11. And when I was asked to contribute to Teaching Beyond September 11 project, I will be very honest that I initially didn't realize what I was getting into, because when we teach classes at the university level, you put together a syllabus, there are readings that you assign. Yes, there's a broader lesson plan and what you will do in your mind, but writing this module for the project and seeing how actual educators put so much effort, and there's so much techniques and so much work that go to the behind of preparing a module, making sure that teachers have everything that they need, making sure that students are expected to engage with credible information, and thinking through the broader project. And I think that's really, as Professor Khan mentioned, a big value of the project, which is that there is interconnections between all these years and what's happening. And I think when you look at the different modules, it really comes across. So some of the educators that I've shared this with have really were impressed with, and I know that not all of the modules are even not yet sort of fully online, and I think it's phase by phase being rolled out, which is I think also a good thing. But that was really insightful for me, and I think that is needed, right? So in short, what we are seeing is that some educators, just off the fly, they need something that they can put in front of their students. There are those who think more long-term and more towards what can I do with this? How can I actually help my students think about these in a critical fashion? And especially for those, I think this is a sustainable sort of like resource. And there are other sort of like, curriculum modules as well. American France Service Committee had put together one project which was really wonderful in the same regard, and many other projects that came out this year, similar to Teaching Beyond September 11 project. So it's our hope that there are now enough credible resources that no educator can come and say, we can't find things to teach about this subject, right? Because now, actually, for people who want to, there are a lot out there, and I think it's also our responsibility to continue to make this more fully available to people, because it takes effort to dig through the archives, so to speak.
Oh, that's certainly fantastic that the resource exists, and I personally look forward to engaging with it with some of the classroom teaching that I do. So thank you both for your involvement in that and for sharing that with our audience. We have a little bit of time left here that I'd like to devote to audience questions. We have one from Haruka Sakaguchi, who asks, so much of the bullying happens at the elementary, middle, and high school level. How can we engage younger Americans in these conversations? Well, Fariha, I know when we were on the Governor's Commission, there was actually a town hall that we had hosted at Al-Aqsa in North Philly um, about bullying specifically, and there were several young people there. Um, have you had other experience in terms of engaging youth in these conversations?
So yes, and I think that was the first time, perhaps when we were doing those town halls, Rob, that we realized the severity of the situation. We were in this meeting, and someone asked about bullying, and the parents that were present said, "Oh, it's really not a problem." And then this, voice in the back of the room said, "Well, actually," and it was a young boy who said, "Actually, I get bullied all the time." And so I think that it is present, it's pervasive. I think that some of the responsibility of the bullying lies with teachers to recognize it, to make sure that there are conversations going on in the classroom about what, embracing the differences that each child brings, but also recognizing that it's incredibly painful and in many cases shameful for a student to be bullied. And so they're hesitant about sharing it. But creating a space where students feel safe enough to say, this is happening to me, is really important. And then, of course, supporting educators as well with resources and tools. And I know that for the state of Pennsylvania, there is, as part of the Department of Education, I'm sure that every state has something similar, but Pennsylvania has specifically the Center for Safe Schools. It's an amazing resource for educators, for parents, for families to connect to recognize bullying, to be able to navigate a school system. Who do I talk to if the teacher isn't responsive? Do I go to the principal? Do I go to the superintendent? And so those resources are available. So I would recommend, if you have any experience with bullying, or you're having your child suffer or something, there are resources available for that at the state level that can then be implemented in the school district. So I would recommend that. But it's incredibly pervasive, and I will share with you all that even my own children suffered some forms of name calling. Both of my boys were called terrorists. They were told they were responsible for 9/11, that their grandparents had done it. And so, this is, it's incredibly painful, right? For the child, for the parent, and then incredibly frustrating when a school does not recognize that kind of behavior, right, from complaints coming from Asian parents, right? It's this model minority myth, like, why are these Asians complaining? They don't recognize it as racism.
Yeah, those are all great points. And Ahmed, I know that CARE does a great deal of work related to combating hate. I'm just curious if you have other thoughts to share.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think to that question, how to engage, what I found benefit is, doing listening sessions with our youth and encouraging them to talk about both the positive and the negative experiences that they are having in their schools. When we do these, we often hear quite a bit of insightful comments from people, right? And that it's not all negative, it's not all positive, and so of course there are both in each experience, but that like Fariha mentioned, name calling, saying, oh, there's a helicopter coming to get you from the yard, and things like that. All these securitized images around Islam and Muslims that we see so much in popular culture and other places definitely find their way. And of course, the broader sort of normalization of anti-Muslim speech in society, including in higher levels of government in the past years, have definitely impacted and normalized a little bit of that. And of course, this racialization of Muslim idea have been there. There's a new book forthcoming by Sahar Aziz from Rutgers called The Racial Muslim. And I think it really does a good job of talking about some of the structural, history behind, how that happens. So I found that it's helpful to do listening sessions and give platforms to youth where they can comfortably share it. And then if there are others in the room that have, experienced similar types of stigmatization, maybe for other identities, that often also builds a bond between these individuals, and people can see also stories of perseverance and of coming through these and getting stronger through those experiences as well.
Yeah, thank you for that, Ahmed. We have another question here from Ken Mochizuki, who asks, for all three of us, have we ever been accused of teaching critical race theory? That's a fun one. I mean, I think it's kind of a buzzword right now in conservative pundits without actually realizing or knowing the context of what critical race theory is. But in general, I think they kind of use it as this umbrella to describe anything that has like a equitable, justice-oriented lens on American history that's not singularly from this sort of conservative, American mythology almost of this kind of triumphant arc of history bending towards justice, U.S. exceptionalism narrative.
Yeah, I've recently attended several school board meetings where this has been the hot button issue, and the type of discourse that you see is really not about critical race theory as a scholarly lens, right? So it's all about other nominers. There's a laundry list of things that people mention and then accuse educators of using. There are like Rob said, certain circles try to debate this, and this was actually quite dominant within the American Muslim community a while back. Some sort of African American Muslim scholars who I think were having some intersections with some of those conservative talking points were talking about this, and we had published this resource about it that I put in the chat, publish on that. But currently what we are seeing is there are intersections between these anti-critical race theory circles and people who try to sort of think around Muslim students' calls for increased inclusion and equity in schools. There are some intersections there that we are seeing, as well as other identities problematizing LGBTQ identities and many others. So that's I think a concerted campaign. And I think at the college level too, that's also very prevalent, not only in the secondary education.
Fariha, have you also dealt with this topic?
I have not. I've had other issues. I am, though, teaching a new course in the spring. It's called American Race. And so critical race theory will be a big part of that. And so I'm sure I'll be getting emails. I'm prepared for that. I have had most recently, the university has co-sponsored a panel on Hindutva, which is a form of sort of politicized right-wing Hinduism that is on the rise in India. And I have gotten several emails about that, that I'm, because Penn is sponsoring it, that, I'm participating in spreading hate and misinformation. I also once in a class, when you get your feedback at the end of the semester, I didn't realize this, but a student wrote, Professor Khan is a good teacher, but she gives way too many leftist articles, which was shocking to me. I was like, oh, do I? I mean, I had no idea that I actually was doing that. But clearly, it was from someone who had a very different political viewpoint on issues of race, because all of our courses talk about race. And so that just was, always struck me as interesting.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of funny too, because so I regularly attend the Critical Mixed Race Studies conference. Like I'm very proud to be someone who practices some of those theory in the classroom. And absolutely, I teach critical race theory. I mean, I think all of us do to some extent who teach in ethnic studies, right? So it's just kind of interesting to see that entering the debate as, at least during the previous administration, there were some pretty specific statements around also DEI initiatives. And that's a big part of the work that I do as well. So at a certain point, it was kind of like waiting for a phone call or a knock on the door. But thankfully, we're in greener pastures at this particular moment on that topic, at least. All right, I think we have time for one last question. This one looks like it's for you, Fariha, from Thomas Kurihara. Was President Johnson's quote a political statement minimizing effect, or his prognostication at expectation? I think you're on mute.
Sorry. Thomas, thank you for that question. And I would guess that it's a little bit of both. So as I think, President Johnson was trying to quell fears, xenophobic fears of mass migration, he also recognized that the U.S. was poised to be a global empire, right? And so immigration was part of the plan. I mean, by not having, open doors for migration, that was going to then negatively impact foreign relations. And so I think the 1965 Act was also a step towards diplomacy on the way to have the US be a global empire, as well as it was to increase a specific kind of labor in the US, right? Medicare and Medicaid were passed, so there was a definite need for healthcare. There was the Cold War and the race to the moon against the Soviet Union. NASA was, growing and blossoming and needed more science and engineers. So, I think all of those pieces were coming together, right? There was xenophobic rhetoric. He wanted to make the civil rights movement happy a little bit. He wanted to make sure that the US was poised to be a global empire as well.
Thanks for elaborating on that, Fariha. And I think that takes us to the end of our time. So I just wanted to thank you both again for participating in this evening's discussion. I've certainly learned a lot, and I'm looking forward to digging through some of these resources that you both provided. So thank you again for being a part of this. Any last thoughts that you'd like to share?
No, I'm very grateful for the conversation. I want to thank everyone who's attended, and I hope you'll use the resources, and contact us if you have any questions. But it's been wonderful to be able to engage with all of you. Thank you, and thank you, Rob.
And like, indeed, thank you so much, Rob, for organizing, and to everyone who attended. It's such a great honor, and I always learn a lot as well. I just hope that we'll have more interactive sessions at some point for us to listen to some of our elders and also others who have diverse sets of experience, so that we can continue to build bridges and make sure that we learn from one another's experiences.
Well, thank you both again for joining us this evening, and thank you to everyone watching from home. Stay safe, and we'll see you next time.